we're going to get into the anatomy of how the workforce is changing. And we've been hearing a little bit of that throughout each of the panels. First, I want to introduce you Lucrecia Bogranova. She is with Mastercard, and Sarah Rhodes, she is with Amazon. Before we get things started, I want you ladies to explain to the audience what exactly your role is so they get a better idea of where you stand in the company. So, Sarah, you are the Global Workforce Health and Safety. You are the vice president of that. So explain what that role entails.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having us on the panel today. I really enjoy these type of events and being able to speak so much about things that we're passionate about, including technology. Specifically, my role is I have the privilege of leading a team of over 10,000 safety professionals who are responsible for the health and safety of over 1 million employees globally. And one of the many things that I am so excited about in the role and that I enjoy is being able to apply technology to make for a safer workplace. And so things like large language models, machine learning, computer vision, AI, these are not new things to Amazon. We've been using this technology over the years, but specifically in my role to apply that now in the safety space and engineer that out globally is so exciting, and we are excited about leading the way in that regard when it comes to technology, the intersection of technology and safety.
All right, and we're going to dig into all of that. Lucrecia, talk about your role. You are the Chief Talent and Organizational Effectiveness Officer. Explain that for me, please.
There you go. We'll do that. Well, thank you for having me. I don't think I've ever been to an event where I was maybe the only or part of the few HR people. So I'm loving this. So I promise I won't geek out too much on HR during the meeting today, but basically what I do is I lead the team that is responsible for future-proofing Mastercard from a talent standpoint. So what I think about my role is we need to make sure that, kind of like the future of Mastercard is taken care of from a talent, from skills, capabilities, culture, and leadership. So I lead a team of now 10,000 people, but 300 incredibly talented individuals that basically take care of the employee life cycle, right? So everything from hiring, onboarding, learning, managing, upskilling, reskilling that we're going to get into, and making sure that, again, that we have the leadership, the culture, and we're creating an environment where everybody can thrive.
All right, excellent. So let's start to dig into it now. So we've been hearing about different topics throughout the panel, how the nature of work is changing, right? We've heard about workforces shrinking. We've heard about roles changing. We've heard about people having to change the way they think before they go into a meeting. All this stuff. Sarah, I'll start with you. How are you meeting these changing times?
Yeah, well, like I mentioned, we're really leaning in on technology, and we're using it to engineer out risk across our global operations. So, for example, when we look at things like processes that require repetitive motion, we're able to apply technology to automate those processes to remove that risk and then use our workforce for more technical roles, because it takes people in order to maintain that level of automation and technology. So we've evolved over the years. I've been with the company now coming up on 15 years, and our landscape looks much different now than it did 15 years ago, but in a very good way, especially given the scope and breadth and scale that we have across the globe.
Now, Lucrecia, talk to us about the different skills that people need in the workplace, and then how are you showing them how to achieve those skills, about upskilling?
You got it. So I think some of the, and some of them, I think they were talked about in the prior panel, right? So when I think about, some of the skills that are becoming in growing demand, I would talk about maybe the technical skills and then the human skills, because I think both of them are becoming equally important. So definitely in the technical skills, I think that, kind of like AI literacy, data fluency are becoming sort of baseline. I think traditionally maybe we're looking at them more in the context of highly technical roles. I think now the expectation is that, you're going to have some level of fluency on the AI and data side across any type of role or any type of job family. And then, of course, there's the human skills that, traditionally we used to talk about those skills like the soft skills, and definitely the softer skills are becoming the harder and the more critical skills, like learning agility, adaptability, curiosity, collaboration, critical thinking are definitely becoming incredibly critical. And I would say probably things like, learning agility, adaptability, becoming a competitive advantage and a differentiator, not only at the individual level, but then also at the organizational level. So, for us at Mastercard we definitely look for and we nurture both the human and the technical skills, because we think that, we'll need a knowledgeable human to really unlock the power of new technologies like artificial intelligence.
So is it changing the way you hire as well, too? Would you look for people to hire?
I think you're definitely starting to look at, those skills in a different way, right? When you kind of you started to see them prevailing a little bit more in your job descriptions, or you're scanning the talent in the marketplace, or when you're doing assessments. And then the same thing when we're starting to think about, how we upskill or reskill our employees, right? I think there's something about making sure that our people are future ready. How do you really take care of, concerns that people may have as it relates to feelings of FOBO, right? Kind of feeling of potentially being obsolete. So there's a lot about, if I think about AI, right? So it's something that we know that we need to make sure that everybody is sort of feeling much more comfortable with that technology, and making sure that they're sort of feeling empowered and enabled. I think there were a couple of questions as it relates to that, right? And really seeing AI as something that is sort of augmenting your role, your well-being, your productivity, your development partner. So we have, from a training standpoint, right, we think about it in kind of 3 tiers. So if you're interested in thinking about how you can start getting sort of AI started within your workforce, right? So first of all, we think that every employee, regardless of the role that they have, has to have a minimum level of AI literacy. That is really critical, to give people the confidence they need to experiment with this new technology. Then you start getting a little bit deeper and to say, hey, depending on the type of the role that you have in the organization, if you're a software engineer, if you're a consultant, if you're in sales, how do you use the AI in the context of your role? And then last but not least is really more about, how do you really sort of upskill or reskill for new emerging type of roles. So, we believe in being very transparent with our workforce and, talking about how is AI going to change your role, and what are some of the, how can we more proactively upskill you, reskill you into roles that are becoming in higher demand, or skills that are becoming in higher demand in the future. But, one of the things that I would say, and I think it was talked about in the prior panel, is we've learned that, underpinning all of this is the culture. You need to have a culture where people trust the technology, because people are not going to use it if they don't trust it. So we find that, the quality of the culture that you create, right, or you're creating an environment where people feel like they can, experiment responsibly, right, that they are given the environment to sort of test and learn and to collaborate with this technology, I think is really paramount to drive, I think, the levels of adoption that we all want to see with these new technologies.
Excellent. And keep on that note of culture, because I'm going to come back to you with that in a second. Sarah, I want you to dive into some specific examples for the audience. So you said health and safety. So what technological advancements have you been working on over at Amazon that have really helped out?
Yes, I have a team of engineers, and we partner very closely with other engineering teams within Amazon. And I'll give 2 specific examples that I think can help provide some context. One technology that we've implemented, particularly in the past year, is called Proteus. And basically it's a robotic drive, an autonomous robotic drive, that is able to coexist with our employees on the front line, on the shop floor, so to speak. And what was once done manually by an employee moving, for example, a cart of packages from point A to point B, now a Proteus drive, basically lifts the cart and moves it and delivers it to the employee. So it just removes an incredible amount of manual movement, saves time for everybody, and also it helps to either reduce or eliminate injury risk as well. So that's one example. A second example that we're humbly proud of, but we've rolled out globally, is called Dragonfly. And Dragonfly, the reason for the name is the Dragonfly has really good vision and can kind of see in all directions. We like to use different names at Amazon. And so from the palm of any employee's hand, they can enter safety suggestions, safety concerns. That then goes directly to their manager. Their manager needs to respond within 24 hours. And it provides that direct feedback loop between the employee and the manager. And we've made it to the level that now an employee can even rate the quality of the manager's response. Think of it like a rating, a 5-star rating. And the importance of this tool is not only the direct feedback that we receive directly from our frontline employees who know exactly maybe where the opportunities are, where the innovation maybe an opportunity. We can now use AI to glean insights globally. So not just from one particular site or location or one particular geography, but I can now use AI to pull any sort of data from around the world to see if there's common themes, and then we apply our programmatics to engineer out that risk or engineer out those themes. Some of the very best ideas are the most simple as well, that we would have maybe not otherwise known at a broader scale if it weren't from the application. So that's another example of how we've applied technology in a very simple use case way for the user, but how we're using then AI to pull those insights.
Yeah. So is it a simple use case? Because what's the process like? Like when you first introduce these things, you hand it over and you say use it, and people are saying, what is this? How do I, what's the process like? What's the process like when all of a sudden robots are going around, the floor next to workers? And explain that,
right.
Some of the challenges.
Well, change management, I think, as many people in the audience know, especially when you're doing it at scale, it can be a challenge. And so that's why communication, first and foremost, explaining what is happening, why it is happening. And a common term that I use with my teams is simple, scalable, and sustainable. So it needs to be very simple for the user and also the person who may be teaching or communicating about it. Scalable, so ideally we do things across geographies and parity as much as possible, and sustainable, so it needs to be able to repeat in order to sustain that, because even sometimes the best of ideas, people may be excited about it for a week or a month or a year, and then it dissipates, but when we really want something to sustain and truly drive continuous improvement, it needs to maintain that. So the communication is key, and the simpler that we can make this technology, the better.
Okay, and something, Lucrecia, you talked about before. I'm going to go because there was a question from the audience too. How has entry-level hiring changed a little bit? Because you kind of mentioned that, how you're looking at hiring a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think it's, definitely, obviously, we're sort of like leveraging AI within our hiring practices. But I would say, definitely what is changing in terms of, I think everybody, we're talking to an Amazon person, it's like an Amazon customer, right? I think everybody's looking in their personal lives and the same in their professional lives, right? A little bit of the similar experience that you look for in your personal life as well, in terms of like this hyper sort of like personalization and customization, right? So something that we have in terms of like for a job seeker, right? Like we have a website where people can actually be served, or like basically identify different types of opportunities depending on kind of like the skills they have, the skills they want to learn. So like a much more personalized sort of like experience across sort of like the employee life cycle, and definitely starting with your kind of like talent acquisitions, like your interviewing, you name it. But definitely there was something, I think, in the question about also learning as well, right? Mm-hmm. How can you create learning that is much more sort of like personalized? So I think that's something that has been incredibly critical for us. I think going back to the conversation that we were having about how do you get your workforce that is like super ready. Yeah. So that is something, and how can you do that sort of like at scale, right? I think in the past we always thought that, hey, kind of like scale and personalization were two things that were contradictory to one another, were not possible. But that is something that, at Mastercard, we're definitely driving, higher levels of sort of like personalization at scale and connecting employees through, platforms like, our AI-driven talent marketplace to different types of opportunities, and could help close some skill gaps that they may have and connect them to like, different types of opportunities like a new job, like learning, like a mentor, a volunteering type of experience, or learning content to help sort of like bridge that skill gap. But I think it does it in a way that is much more personalized and sort of like meets you where you are in your journey.
Now, were there any challenges you reached as far as upskilling workers or having them to learn these new skills that you were talking about? What challenges, what roadblocks, what advice can you offer to the audience who may be going through the same thing with their employees?
I think that, it's like something obviously very consistent in all of the conversations we were having today is like the speed of change. And I think from a talent standpoint, I mean, obviously that represents incredible amount of change. You have to really think very critically about like how the talent needs are changing as the demands of the business are changing. So, I think that probably the agility and the flexibility of the workforce has never been more critical. So what we're doing at Mastercard is we're taking a much more skills-based approach. So we're focusing more on skills, sort of like as a factor to make decisions across the employee life cycle versus more traditional parameters like degrees, right, or experiences, because we believe that when you focus on skills, you can sort of like create much more agility and flexibility, and you can be able to like hire, redeploy, upskill the talent in the organization much faster to meet this kind of like changing needs of the business. So that would be something that I would say it's a practice that definitely helps quite a bit with that. And as I was saying earlier, right, an example of that is our talent marketplace, where we have like 35,000 of our employees that, based on the skills they have versus the skills they want to build, they're connected to different types of opportunities. And what I would say is, some of the early successes that we have seen from the platform, like really reinforce that when you focus on skills versus other parameters, like you can really democratize access to opportunities, and you can really open up probably career paths to people that they actually wouldn't have had, or you can create much more flexibility in your workforce, right? Because your needs of tomorrow may not, may not, will be served by different skills that and that you so that you can sort of like be much more proactive about upskilling and reskilling those people that you need in the future.
Good. And we want to talk about the future, too, because I want to see what future trends you guys are seeing. Before we get to that, when I sat down, I kind of go through everyone's bio. And Sarah, something stood out to me from your bio. You have a background as a U.S. Navy fighter pilot. Okay, now that's not something you see on everyday bios. Now, how did that role, first of all, thank you for your service, but how did that role prepare you for what you're doing now at Amazon when it comes to safety, I'm sure?
Yeah, actually, there are a lot of translatable skills from aviation into the role that I'm currently serving in at Amazon. And I think, as the audience knows, the margin for error in aviation is so small, but the consequences can be so high. So in aviation, it's so important that you get it right. Processes, procedures, standard work, solid training, definitely a proactive safety mindset. In aviation in general, it is very open when it comes to calling out safety concerns, suggestions for improvement. And so now in this role at Amazon, of course, we're not operating in that type of environment, but at the same time, I've applied and have worked with my team to apply a proactive mindset to safety. So staying ahead of risk and incidents before it even becomes an issue. And we do that then by engineering out risk. So, an incident or accident cannot happen if the risk doesn't exist. And so that's, I think, probably the simplest way to say how I've translated at least the safety mindset from aviation into now our very large global workforce. And so just for context, in the U.S. we have over 700,000 employees, which is around twice the size of the U.S. Navy. So there's some translatable things there, just in terms of size and how we do need to make sure that we are doing things in a very scalable way, like I mentioned.
Now, as we look a step forward, Lucrecia, how else do you see the workplace changing? Like, what are you keeping an eye on, that you think is on the horizon next? What's keeping you up at night when you sleep? What's on your mind?
Well, we talked about the reskilling, upskilling of the workforce for sure. I think the other piece with that, probably looking at how do you rewire all of the people experiences being AI first and equally inclusive. The other one I think we talked about in the prior panel too is kind of like AI-driven work transformation. So obviously we're talking a lot about the workforce, but then when you think about how the work will continue to change, work redesign, as you start thinking about this blending of the human and the digital worker. So how you start thinking about, how organizations will be designed in the future, definitely beyond the org chart that we know today. Flatter organizations, more network-based, kind of like combination of like skills, tasks, and this blending that we were talking about of like humans and digital workers. And I think in the middle of that is, the future of leadership. I think we talked a little about culture, but, the future of the leader. So what does it mean to be a leader in this context that we've been talking about today? What type of leader is it going to require? So I think a lot about, we're living in a world where there's like a lot of complexity. So like, clarity from a leader, I think is becoming incredibly important. Like the wisdom of the leader, the clarity, the critical thinking, and probably the emotional connectivity, right? Emotional connection and empathy, compassion are skills that are going to become incredibly critical. And I think connected to leadership too is about, the pipeline of leader. When I think about my role in the organization, it's all about, securing the future by also making sure that we have the right leaders. And when I think about, potentially the impact of AI on entry-level roles, what is the potential impact of that on the leadership pipeline, and how do we need to think differently about, some of these entry-level jobs, to the question earlier, to help bridge a little bit of those gaps. So those are some of the few things that keep me up at night.
You got a lot on your mind. And Sarah, if you could wrap it up for us too, and what technological advancements are you kind of keeping an eye on that you think might be on the way? And then also at the same time, what's becoming obsolete?
Yeah, I'm really excited about computer vision and some of the, and applying, computer vision with the AI capabilities with that as well. So that's, we're continuing to lean in that space. And then in terms of things becoming obsolete, I would say from a safety perspective, it's not quite obsolete, but like I mentioned earlier, engineering out manual processes as much as we can. But I am excited, though, too, because of the advancements in technology as we're applying it to our operations. There are opportunities for upskilling across our workforce. We have a program called Career Choice where our teams are able to get new skill sets, learn new technologies through Amazon funding to do that. And so then we can then translate that new skill set to application of the technology across our workforce. So I'm really excited about the future, honestly. I think the best is yet to come, and stay tuned in this space from our perspective.
All right, ladies, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.